In the year 69 before Christ, along the banks of the mighty Nile River, a child was born who would become one of the most captivating figures in human history. Cleopatra II, Cleopatra, entered the world at a moment of profound political turbulence, when Egypt, once the most powerful kingdom of the ancient world, found itself teetering on the brink of collapse under the weight of internal conflicts and mounting external pressures. The Ptolemaic dynasty, to which Cleopatra belonged, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, ever since Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, established his dominion over this land of pharaohs. For generations, the Ptolemies maintained a peculiar and controversial tradition, marriages between siblings to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline. This practice, though shocking by modern standards, was viewed as essential for maintaining the divine legitimacy of the royal family in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects. The royal palace of Alexandria, where Cleopatra spent her earliest years, was a world of unimaginable luxury and deadly intrigue. White marble walls reflected the Mediterranean light, while hanging gardens perfumed with jasmine and roses created an atmosphere of ethereal beauty. However, behind this facade of splendor, conspiracies and assassinations were as common as daily meals. The young princess grew up knowing that survival depended not merely on intelligence, but on political cunning, refined from childhood. Unlike her predecessors, who frequently scorned native Egyptian culture, Cleopatra demonstrated from an early age a genuine interest in local traditions. By the age of 8, she already spoke ancient Egyptian fluently, becoming the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to master the language of her subjects. This decision was not merely academic. It was a brilliant political strategy that would allow her to connect directly with the Egyptian people, bypassing the Greek aristocracy that traditionally served as intermediaries. Her education was extraordinarily comprehensive, even by the standards of the Alexandrian elite. Cleopatra studied rhetoric with the finest orators of the age, philosophy with disciples of Aristotle, mathematics with heirs to the Euclidean tradition, and astronomy in the same halls where Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference. The famous Library of Alexandria, with its 500,000 scrolls, became her second home, where she absorbed knowledge ranging from ancient Egyptian medicine to the latest Greek scientific discoveries. By age 12, Cleopatra already displayed a magnetic personality that combined natural charm with penetrating intelligence. Foreign ambassadors frequently commented on the impressive presence of the young princess, who could maintain sophisticated conversations about politics, philosophy, and sciences with men 3 times her age. Her voice, described by contemporaries as melodious and mesmerizing, would later become one of her most powerful political weapons. The Egypt of her youth faced monumental challenges. The Nile floods, essential for agriculture, had been irregular, causing famines that stirred the masses. Simultaneously, Rome was growing in power and influence, transforming from ally into an existential threat to Egyptian independence. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, known derisively as Auletes, meaning the flute player, had been forced to accept Roman protection, paying humiliating tributes that drained the royal treasury. In this environment of constant crisis, Cleopatra learned lessons that would shape her future approach to leadership. She observed how her father navigated between rival factions, how he balanced Rome's demands with Egyptian subjects' needs, and how diplomacy could be more powerful than armies. These formative experiences planted the seeds of her future mastery in strategic alliances and political manipulation. At 16, when her father's death placed her on the direct path to the throne, Cleopatra had already transformed into a young woman of remarkable beauty and formidable intellect. However, she knew she would inherit not just a crown, but also a crisis that threatened to destroy 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule over Egypt. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 before Christ, 18-year-old Cleopatra found herself thrust into a political maelstrom that would have destroyed lesser mortals. According to Ptolemaic tradition, she was required to share power with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, in a co-regency that was meant to ensure stability, but instead ignited a civil war that nearly ended her reign before it truly began. The young queen's first challenge came not from external enemies, but from within her own court. The Regency Council, dominated by three powerful men, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the tutor Apollodorus, viewed Cleopatra as a temporary inconvenience rather than their rightful sovereign. These men had grown accustomed to wielding power during the final years of her father's weakened reign, and they had no intention of surrendering their influence to a teenage girl, regardless of her royal bloodline. Cleopatra's response to this challenge revealed the steel beneath her elegant exterior. Rather than accepting a ceremonial role, she began asserting her authority with calculated boldness. She appeared alone on official documents, breaking the tradition of joint rule. She ordered coins minted bearing only her image, a deliberate snub to her brother's supporters. Most provocatively, she began appearing in public dressed as the goddess Isis, claiming divine authority that transcended earthly political arrangements. The economic situation she inherited was catastrophic. Egypt's treasury was nearly empty, drained by her father's payments to Rome and years of poor harvests. The common people suffered under crushing taxation, while the wealthy Greek minority hoarded their wealth. Cleopatra recognized that her survival depended on winning the loyalty of the Egyptian masses, something no Ptolemaic ruler had seriously attempted in generations. Her first major policy initiative demonstrated her political genius. She personally traveled to Upper Egypt during a famine, distributing grain from the royal reserves and speaking to crowds in their native language. The sight of their queen addressing them as Egyptians rather than subjects created an emotional connection that her predecessors had never achieved. For the first time in centuries, the people of Egypt felt they had a pharaoh who truly belonged to them. However, this populist approach terrified the Alexandrian elite, who feared losing their privileged position. The Regency Council began plotting against her, using her young brother as their puppet. They spread rumors that Cleopatra was planning to abandon Greek traditions entirely and transform Egypt into a purely native kingdom. These whispers found receptive ears among the wealthy merchants and landowners who formed the backbone of Alexandria's power structure. The crisis erupted in 48 TEM before Christ, when Cleopatra's enemies succeeded in driving her from Alexandria. Forced to flee with only a handful of loyal supporters, she found herself an exile in her own kingdom. Many observers expected this to be the end of her story, another failed Ptolemaic ruler destroyed by court intrigue. They gravely underestimated both her determination and her strategic brilliance. From her exile in Upper Egypt, Cleopatra began building an army, but not in the traditional manner. Instead of relying solely on Greek mercenaries, she recruited heavily from the native Egyptian population, promising them land reforms and tax relief in exchange for their service. This revolutionary approach created a military force that was not just fighting for pay, but for a vision of Egypt's future that included them as full participants rather than mere subjects. Meanwhile, the political landscape of the Mediterranean was shifting dramatically. Julius Caesar and Pompey, the two most powerful men in Rome, had begun their final confrontation for control of the Roman world. When Pompey fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary, Cleopatra's enemies made a fatal miscalculation. Believing they could curry favor with Caesar, they murdered Pompey upon his arrival, presenting his severed head as a gift to the Roman general. Caesar's reaction was not gratitude, but disgust. The murder of Pompey, whatever their differences, was an affront to Roman dignity and Caesar's own authority. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he found a kingdom in chaos, ruled by advisors who had just demonstrated their untrustworthiness through treachery. This created an opportunity that Cleopatra, despite her exile, was perfectly positioned to exploit. The young queen's next move became the stuff of legend. Recognizing that a direct approach to Alexandria would result in her capture or death, she devised a plan that was equal parts audacious and brilliant. Smuggled into the city hidden in a carpet, she gained access to Caesar's presence in a manner that was both dramatic and symbolic, emerging literally from the fabric of Egypt itself. This famous encounter was not merely a romantic gambit, as later propaganda would suggest, but a masterpiece of political theater. Cleopatra understood that Caesar, like all Romans, was fascinated by spectacle and impressed by boldness. By risking everything on this single meeting, she demonstrated the kind of courage that Romans admired while simultaneously presenting herself as Egypt incarnate, beautiful, mysterious, and worth protecting. The meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra changed the course of both their lives and the history of the ancient world. Here was a Roman general at the height of his power, meeting an Egyptian queen fighting for her very survival, and discovering in each other not just political allies, but intellectual equals who shared a vision of what the Mediterranean world could become. The alliance between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra transformed from a desperate political gambit into one of history's most consequential partnerships. When Caesar agreed to support her claim to the Egyptian throne, he was not merely helping a displaced queen. He was reshaping the balance of power across the entire Mediterranean world. The Alexandrian War that followed would prove that Cleopatra possessed not only the intelligence to forge crucial alliances, but also the ruthless determination necessary to reclaim and hold power. The conflict began almost immediately after Cleopatra's dramatic appearance before Caesar. Her brother's advisors, realizing that their puppet king was now threatened by Roman military might, mobilized the Egyptian army against the foreign invaders. What they failed to anticipate was how effectively Cleopatra had prepared for this moment. Her months in exile had not been spent in idle waiting, but in building a network of supporters who were ready to rise when she gave the signal. The siege of Alexandria became a brutal urban warfare that lasted for months. Caesar found himself trapped in the palace quarter with only a small force, while Cleopatra's enemies controlled most of the city. The famous Library of Alexandria, repository of centuries of human knowledge, was partially destroyed during the fighting, a tragic loss that symbolized how the struggle for power often consumes the very civilization it claims to protect. During these desperate months, Cleopatra proved herself to be far more than a figurehead. She personally coordinated supply lines, managed diplomatic communications with potential allies, and even participated in strategic planning sessions with Caesar's officers. Roman historians, despite their cultural prejudices against foreign queens, could not help but acknowledge her military acumen and unwavering courage under pressure. The turning point came when reinforcements arrived from Rome, but the victory was sealed by Cleopatra's political genius. She had secretly negotiated with several Egyptian generals, promising them positions of honor in her restored government. When the final battle commenced, these officers switched sides at the crucial moment, turning what should have been a Roman victory into an Egyptian triumph. Ptolemy XIII died during the fighting, whether by accident or design, removing the last obstacle to Cleopatra's undisputed rule. With her throne secured, Cleopatra faced the monumental task of rebuilding a kingdom that had been devastated by civil war. The economy was in ruins, the military was demoralized, and the population was exhausted by years of conflict. Lesser rulers might have focused solely on consolidating power, but Cleopatra understood that true strength came from the prosperity and loyalty of her subjects. Her first major initiative was a comprehensive economic reform program that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of statecraft. She reduced taxes on the common people while increasing levies on the wealthy Greek minority who had supported her enemies. She invested heavily in irrigation projects that would increase agricultural productivity, and she established new trade routes that bypassed traditional Roman intermediaries. These policies not only restored Egypt's finances, but also created a broad base of popular support that would sustain her through future challenges. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra during this period was complex and multifaceted. While their personal connection was undeniable, their political partnership was based on mutual benefit rather than mere romantic attraction. Caesar gained access to Egypt's vast wealth and strategic position, while Cleopatra secured Roman protection and international legitimacy. Their son, Caesarion, born in 47 before Christ, symbolized this alliance and represented Cleopatra's hope for a dynasty that would unite the best of both civilizations. In 46 before Christ, Cleopatra made the bold decision to visit Rome, bringing Caesarion with her and establishing residence in Caesar's villa across the Tiber. This visit was a diplomatic masterstroke that served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Egypt's independence and equality with Rome. It allowed Cleopatra to study Roman politics firsthand, and it positioned her son as a potential heir to Caesar's legacy. Roman society's reaction to Cleopatra's presence was a mixture of fascination and scandal. Her intelligence and education impressed even Caesar's most sophisticated friends, while her exotic beauty and mysterious Eastern customs captivated the Roman imagination. She held salons where philosophers, poets, and politicians gathered to discuss everything from mathematics to metaphysics, establishing herself as a patron of learning in the tradition of the great Hellenistic queens. However, Cleopatra's success in Rome also created dangerous enemies. Conservative senators viewed her as a corrupting foreign influence who was undermining traditional Roman values. They whispered that Caesar planned to make himself king, with Cleopatra as his queen, transforming the Roman Republic into an Eastern-style monarchy. These fears contributed to the conspiracy that would ultimately cost Caesar his life. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 before Christ shattered Cleopatra's carefully constructed world. She was in Rome when the murder occurred, and she immediately recognized that her position had become untenable. The conspirators viewed her as a symbol of everything they opposed about Caesar's rule, and her continued presence in the city would only provide them with a convenient target for their anger. Cleopatra's escape from Rome demonstrated the same combination of courage and cunning that had characterized her entire rise to power. Rather than fleeing in panic, she methodically secured her assets, gathered intelligence about the political situation, and planned her departure to maximize her future options. She understood that Caesar's death was not just a personal tragedy, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would require entirely new strategies for survival. Returning to Egypt, Cleopatra found herself once again fighting for her kingdom's independence. But now she possessed something she had lacked during her first struggle: experience, resources, and the unshakable confidence that came from having already achieved the impossible once before. Following the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 before Christ, Cleopatra VII Philopator faced a rapidly shifting political landscape that would test every skill she had acquired during her tumultuous rise to power. With her son Caesarion, whom she claimed was Caesar's heir, she returned to Egypt determined to fortify her kingdom's sovereignty amidst the rising tensions of a Roman republic tearing itself apart in civil war. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's death plunged the Mediterranean world into chaos. Three men emerged to claim his legacy: Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and master of rhetoric; Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir; and Lepidus, a skilled administrator who controlled crucial military resources. This second triumvirate would reshape the ancient world, and Cleopatra understood that Egypt's survival depended on choosing the right ally among these powerful rivals. During this period of uncertainty, Cleopatra demonstrated the full extent of her administrative genius by transforming Egypt into the most prosperous kingdom in the Mediterranean. She implemented sweeping economic reforms that reduced agricultural taxes, encouraging increased production, and alleviating the burden on farmers who had suffered under previous regimes. She promoted trade and commerce by establishing new commercial partnerships with kingdoms as distant as India and Ethiopia, creating wealth that flowed through Alexandria's bustling markets. The Queen's cultural achievements during this era were equally remarkable. Alexandria flourished as the undisputed center of Hellenistic civilization, attracting scholars, artists, and philosophers from across the known world. Cleopatra herself was renowned for her intellectual prowess, speaking 9 languages fluently and engaging in sophisticated debates with the greatest minds of her age. Her court became a beacon of learning, where mathematical treatises were written, astronomical observations were recorded, and literary masterpieces were composed. The famous meeting between Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 41 before Christ at Tarsus became one of history's most legendary encounters, though the reality was far more complex than later romantic interpretations suggested. Cleopatra arrived not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as an equal partner proposing a strategic alliance. Her golden barge, with purple sails and silver oars, was designed to demonstrate Egypt's wealth and sophistication, while her appearance dressed as Aphrodite sent a clear message about the divine nature of her authority. Antony, despite his reputation as a pleasure-seeking hedonist, was actually a shrewd politician who recognized the value of Cleopatra's proposal. Egypt's vast resources could fund his planned military campaigns against the Parthian Empire, while Cleopatra's naval forces could secure the eastern Mediterranean. Their partnership, which produced 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus, represented a fusion of Roman military might and Egyptian wealth that threatened to reshape the balance of power. The peak of Cleopatra's influence came during the so-called Donations of Alexandria in 34 before Christ, a magnificent ceremony that demonstrated the full extent of her ambitions. Before a crowd of thousands in Alexandria's great gymnasium, Antony formally distributed territories among Cleopatra and their children, effectively creating a new Eastern empire that stretched from Armenia to Cyrenaica. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, while Caesarion was recognized as King of Kings and legitimate heir to Julius Caesar's legacy. This grand spectacle was not merely theatrical display, but a carefully calculated political statement. Cleopatra was announcing her intention to restore the Hellenistic kingdoms that had flourished after Alexander the Great's conquests, with Egypt as the dominant power. She envisioned a Mediterranean world where East and West were equal partners, rather than conqueror and conquered, a revolutionary concept that challenged Rome's assumption of natural superiority. During this golden period, Cleopatra's domestic achievements were equally impressive. She oversaw massive construction projects that beautified Alexandria and improved infrastructure throughout Egypt. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was restored to its full glory, while new temples dedicated to both Egyptian and Greek deities demonstrated her commitment to cultural synthesis. She established schools where Egyptian children could learn alongside Greeks, breaking down barriers that had existed for centuries. Cleopatra's naval innovations during this period revolutionized Mediterranean warfare. She commissioned the construction of massive warships that combined traditional Egyptian shipbuilding techniques with Roman military engineering. These vessels, some reportedly over 400 feet long, were floating fortresses equipped with catapults, ballistae, and even primitive flamethrowers. Her fleet became the most formidable naval force in the Mediterranean, capable of challenging Roman supremacy on the seas. The Queen's diplomatic achievements extended far beyond her alliance with Antony. She maintained correspondence with rulers from Britain to India, creating a network of relationships that positioned Egypt as a central player in international affairs. Her ambassadors were welcomed in courts from Nubia to Armenia, while foreign dignitaries competed for the honor of visiting Alexandria and experiencing the splendor of her court. However, these very successes created the conditions for Cleopatra's eventual downfall. Octavian, observing the growing power of the Antony-Cleopatra alliance, recognized that his own position in Rome was threatened. He launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign that portrayed Cleopatra not as a legitimate queen, but as a foreign seductress who had corrupted noble Roman virtues. This narrative, though historically inaccurate, proved devastatingly effective in turning Roman public opinion against the Eastern Alliance. The irony of Cleopatra's situation was that her greatest achievements, the restoration of Egyptian prosperity, the creation of a powerful Eastern coalition, and the establishment of a new model for Mediterranean civilization, were precisely what made her an existential threat to Roman ambitions. She had succeeded too well, creating an alternative vision of the future that challenged Rome's destiny as the sole master of the ancient world. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony, once a formidable force in the Mediterranean, began to unravel under the relentless pressure from Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir. The political and military tensions culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ, a decisive confrontation that would seal the fate of both Antony and Cleopatra, and with them, the last vestiges of Hellenistic independence in the ancient world. The events leading to Actium revealed the fatal weaknesses in the Antony-Cleopatra alliance. Despite their combined resources, they faced a fundamental strategic disadvantage. Octavian had successfully portrayed their partnership as a foreign threat to Roman values and traditions. His propaganda machine, led by skilled orators and poets, painted Cleopatra as an Eastern sorceress who had bewitched noble Roman leaders, transforming what should have been seen as a legitimate political alliance into a narrative of corruption and betrayal. Antony's position in Rome deteriorated rapidly as Octavian systematically dismantled his support network. Former allies abandoned him. Senators who had once courted his favor now denounced him as a traitor to Roman ideals. And even his own soldiers began to question their loyalty to a commander who seemed more Egyptian than Roman. The final break came when Octavian read Antony's will to the Roman Senate, revealing his desire to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, a revelation that shocked Romans who viewed such a preference as the ultimate rejection of their civilization. The naval confrontation at Actium on September 2nd, 31 before Christ, was less a battle than a catastrophic collapse of morale and strategy. Cleopatra and Antony commanded a fleet of over 500 ships, including massive Egyptian warships that should have dominated the smaller Roman vessels. However, Octavian's admiral Agrippa had positioned his forces brilliantly, using the wind and current to his advantage while exploiting the unwieldy nature of the Egyptian superships. The turning point came when Cleopatra, observing the deteriorating tactical situation and perhaps recognizing that defeat was inevitable, ordered her squadron to withdraw from the battle. Her decision was likely strategic rather than cowardly, preserving her fleet and treasury for future resistance rather than sacrificing everything in a single engagement. However, when Antony followed her retreat, abandoning his own forces in the midst of combat, the psychological impact was devastating. His remaining ships surrendered en masse, and his land forces soon followed suit. The retreat to Alexandria marked the beginning of a desperate final chapter. Cleopatra and Antony found themselves trapped in their capital city, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by former allies. The queen's attempts to negotiate with Octavian revealed both her political sophistication and the hopelessness of her situation. She offered vast treasures, promised to abdicate in favor of her children, and even suggested a marriage alliance, anything to preserve some vestige of Egyptian independence. Octavian's responses to these overtures demonstrated his understanding that Cleopatra represented more than just a political opponent. She embodied an alternative vision of Mediterranean civilization that challenged Roman supremacy. Her very existence as an independent, powerful female ruler contradicted Roman beliefs about natural hierarchy and proper governance. For Octavian to truly establish his authority, Cleopatra had to be not merely defeated, but utterly destroyed as a symbol of resistance. The final siege of Alexandria in 30 before Christ was a foregone conclusion, but Cleopatra's behavior during these last months revealed the full measure of her character. Rather than succumbing to despair, she continued to govern Egypt with the same attention to detail that had characterized her entire reign. She ensured that grain stores were distributed to the poor, that temples continued to function, and that the basic machinery of government operated even as enemy forces closed in around the city. The death of Mark Antony, who fell on his sword after receiving false reports of Cleopatra's suicide, left the queen entirely alone to face her fate. When Octavian's forces finally breached Alexandria's defenses, they found Cleopatra barricaded in her mausoleum, surrounded by the treasures of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Her final negotiations with Octavian were conducted through intermediaries, as both leaders understood that a face-to-face meeting would be too dangerous, for different reasons. Cleopatra's suicide on August 12, 30 before Christ, was her final act of political defiance. By choosing the manner and timing of her death, she denied Octavian the propaganda victory of parading her through Rome as a captive. The method of her suicide, whether by ass bite, poison, or some other means, remains historically uncertain, but the symbolism was clear. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, refusing to submit to foreign domination. The immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death saw the systematic destruction of everything she had built. Octavian ordered the execution of Caesarion, eliminating any potential rival to his authority, while her other children were taken to Rome as hostages. Egypt was transformed from an independent kingdom into a Roman province, its vast wealth flowing directly into Octavian's treasury to fund his transformation into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. However, Cleopatra's legacy proved impossible to erase. Her story captured the imagination of subsequent generations, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and drama. More importantly, she had demonstrated that effective leadership was not limited by gender or nationality, that intelligence and determination could challenge even the mightiest empires, and that the human spirit could maintain its dignity even in the face of overwhelming defeat. The historical Cleopatra, brilliant administrator, skilled diplomat, patron of learning, and defender of Egyptian independence, gradually became obscured by romantic legends that emphasized her beauty and relationships while minimizing her political achievements. Yet even these distorted narratives could not entirely suppress the fundamental truth of her story: that she had been one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world, whose vision of a multicultural Mediterranean civilization was centuries ahead of its time. Today, as we reflect on Cleopatra's extraordinary life, we see not just the last pharaoh of Egypt, but a woman who dared to challenge the assumptions of her age and who paid the ultimate price for her ambitions. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the victors who write it, but by those who refuse to accept defeat, even when facing impossible odds. What aspects of Cleopatra's remarkable journey resonate most strongly with you? Was it her political brilliance, her cultural achievements, or perhaps her tragic but dignified end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're eager to hear your perspectives on this fascinating historical figure. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Cleopatra's life and legacy, please subscribe to Icons of History for more compelling stories about the extraordinary individuals who shaped our world. Next week, we'll explore the life of another remarkable leader who defied convention and changed the course of history. Until then, thank you for joining us on this journey through the ages.